Black woman asked to prove first-class ticket, then reveals she's a Supreme Court judge. Angela Carter stared out the airport terminal window, watching planes take off into the clear morning sky. Her shoulders relaxed for what felt like the first time in months. After 3 back-to-back murder trials and a complex constitutional challenge, this trip to Washington, D.C. was her escape valve, even if it was for another conference. She checked her watch, a simple silver piece her mother had given her when she passed the bar exam. 20 minutes until boarding. Just enough time to grab a coffee and answer a few urgent emails. As she walked to the airport cafe, her comfortable flats made soft sounds against the polished floor. She noticed how different she felt without her judicial robes. Her navy blazer and cream blouse felt almost casual in comparison. The barista smiled at her order, a simple Americano, no sugar. "Rough morning?" he asked, noticing the slight shadow under her eyes. "More like rough month," Angela replied with a warm smile. "But things are looking up. Got a nice quiet flight ahead of me." She found a seat near her gate, sipping the coffee and feeling the warmth spread through her chest. Her phone buzzed with a message from her clerk, Thomas. "Judge Carter, the Thompson brief just came in. Should I forward it?" Angela typed back quickly, "Not unless the building's on fire. I'm officially off duty until Monday." She added a smiley face, something she rarely did, but today felt different. The weight of constant decision-making, of lives hanging in the balance of her judgment, seemed to lift slightly from her shoulders. A family walked past, mom, dad, 2 kids, all wearing matching Mickey Mouse ears, probably heading to Disney. Angela smiled, remembering her own childhood trips with her parents. Her father, a high school history teacher, had always made every journey feel like an adventure, even if it was just a drive to visit relatives in the next state. The boarding call for first class pulled her from her memories. Angela gathered her carry-on, a sleek leather bag that had seen more courthouses than vacation spots, and joined the line. A businessman in front of her was arguing loudly into his phone about market shares and quarterly reports. Behind her, a young woman in yoga pants was trying to wrangle an oversized backpack into a more manageable position. Normal people. Normal lives, asterisk asterisk. Sometimes Angela forgot what that felt like. Between the heavy cases, the media attention that came with being one of the few black female Supreme Court judges, and the constant pressure to be perfect, normal had become a luxury. As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, a young girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered loud enough for Angela to hear, "Mommy, she looks like my teacher, Miss Jackson." Angela smiled to herself as she walked down the jet bridge. She'd heard plenty of comparisons over the years, but teacher was new. Usually, people assumed she was a businesswoman or maybe a lawyer, but rarely did they guess her actual role. It was refreshing, in a way, this momentary anonymity. The first-class cabin welcomed her with its subtle lighting and spacious seats. Angela found her spot by the window, 2A. She specifically requested it, wanting to watch the clouds pass by during the flight. As she stored her bag in the overhead compartment, she noticed how the cabin slowly filled with the usual mix of business travelers. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect in first class, men in expensive suits tapping away at laptops or talking in hushed tones about deals and meetings. A few women too, though noticeably fewer, all projecting that careful balance of power and femininity that Angela knew all too well. She settled into her seat, enjoying the extra legroom. Her sister, Sarah, had always teased her about flying fancy, but after 15 years on the bench, Angela had learned to appreciate these small comforts. The leather seat cradled her tired body, and for once, she didn't feel guilty about the luxury. A flight attendant passed by, offering pre-flight drinks. "Water, please," Angela said, knowing she should stay hydrated for the conference ahead. As she sipped the water, she pulled out her phone one last time before takeoff. A text from her daughter, Maya, popped up. "Crush that conference, Mom. Show them what a Carter woman can do. Flexed biceps, medium dark skin tone asterisk asterisk." Angela grinned at her phone. Maya, now in her second year of law school, had inherited her mother's determination and her father's wit. The combination made for some interesting family dinners, especially when they got into debates about current cases. The cabin continued to fill around her. A woman in a sharp pantsuit took the aisle seat in her row, barely glancing at Angela as she sat down. That was fine by her. Angela had plenty of practice being invisible. Despite her position, it was almost amusing how often people looked right through her until they learned who she was. She thought about the conference ahead, 3 days of panels, discussions, and networking. Her session on modern challenges in constitutional interpretation was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. The speech was ready, practiced to perfection in her home office last week, with Maya acting as her test audience. The engines hummed to life, and Angela felt that familiar flutter in her stomach. Not fear, just the anticipation of taking flight. She'd never quite gotten over the magic of it, how something so heavy could soar through the sky. Her father used to say it was just like life, sometimes the heaviest things could rise above it all, if given the right conditions. The safety demonstration began, but Angela's mind drifted to the quiet evening ahead in her hotel room. Room service, maybe a long bath, and absolutely no legal briefs to review. The thought alone made her smile. These moments of peace were rare in her world of precedents and procedures. As the plane began to taxi, Angela closed her eyes, feeling the tension in her neck start to fade. The constant weight of responsibility, of knowing her decisions affected real lives, seemed to lift slightly with each turn of the wheels. For just a few hours, she could be another passenger on another flight, heading somewhere new. The takeoff roll began, and Angela felt that familiar push back into her seat. Through the window, she watched the ground fall away, the airport becoming smaller, the city turning into a maze of tiny streets and buildings. Up here, everything looked simpler, more manageable. Problems seemed smaller from 30,000 feet. Little did she know that in just a few minutes, her peaceful retreat would be interrupted by a confrontation that would remind her exactly why these moments of peace were so precious and why her position in society remained both a burden and a blessing. The plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and Angela reached for her book, a novel, not a legal text for once. Just as she was about to open it to the bookmarked page, a shadow fell across her seat, bringing with it a presence that would turn this routine flight into something entirely unexpected. The shadow belonged to Mitchell, a man who looked like he spent his weekends at country clubs. His press suit and carefully styled hair screamed corporate success, but his expression carried that particular mix of entitlement and suspicion that Angela had seen countless times before. "Excuse me," he said, not really making it sound like an excuse at all. "I believe you might be in the wrong section." He wasn't alone. A flight attendant hovered behind him, her professional smile looking increasingly strained. Angela took a slow breath, the kind she used in court when a particularly difficult attorney was testing her patience. She reached for her ticket, though she knew exactly where she was supposed to be. Seat 2A had been her choice, specifically picked for the view and the quiet. "I'm in my assigned seat," she said simply, holding out her boarding pass. The paper was crisp, first class clearly printed in bold letters. Mitchell barely glanced at it. "These are first-class seats," he said, as if explaining something to a child. "Perhaps you got turned around during boarding." His voice carried through the cabin, causing several heads to turn. Some passengers quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in their phones or magazines. Others watched with unconcealed curiosity. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Sarah, stepped forward. "Ma'am, could I just double-check your ticket?" Her tone was polite enough, but there was that underlying doubt that made Angela's stomach tighten. She'd felt it before. In high-end stores, at exclusive restaurants, even walking into her own courthouse the first few times before people learned who she was. "Of course," Angela replied, her voice steady despite the familiar burn of frustration rising in her chest. She handed over her ticket again, watching as Sarah examined it with far more scrutiny than she'd shown to any other passenger's boarding pass. Mitchell stood there the whole time, his presence an unwelcome shadow over Angela's seat. She could smell his expensive cologne, something woody and overwhelming. Behind him, a line was forming as other passengers tried to reach their seats, but he seemed oblivious to the disruption he was causing. "I don't mean to cause any trouble," he said in a tone that suggested he was doing exactly that. "But there must be some mistake. Perhaps we could sort this out quickly." He glanced meaningfully at the economy section behind the curtain. Angela felt the eyes of other passengers on her. The woman in the aisle seat next to her had stopped pretending to read her magazine and was now openly watching the scene unfold. A man across the aisle had removed his AirPods, clearly interested in the developing situation. The familiarity of it all was exhausting. Angela had hoped that after decades of achievement, after rising to one of the highest positions in the American judicial system, these moments would become less frequent. But here she was, being questioned about her right to occupy space in first class, as if the very idea of her presence there was somehow suspicious. She thought about Maya, about what she would tell her daughter to do in this situation. Maya, with her fierce sense of justice and quick tongue, would probably launch into a passionate speech about prejudice and assumptions. But Angela had learned over the years that sometimes the quietest responses spoke the loudest. "Sir," Angela said, keeping her voice level, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She met his gaze steadily, years of courtroom experience helping her maintain her composure. "Perhaps you'd like to check your own seat assignment." Mitchell's face flushed slightly. "I know where my seat is," he said, his tone sharpening. "I fly first class regularly, and I just thought." "You thought what, exactly?" Angela asked, still calm but with an edge of steel in her voice, the same edge she used when attorneys in her courtroom started to cross lines they shouldn't. The flight attendant finished her examination of the ticket, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "The ticket is valid for the seat," she confirmed, though her tone suggested she was somehow surprised by this fact. More passengers were watching now. A young man in a tech company hoodie had stopped typing to observe. An elderly woman a few rows ahead had turned around in her seat, frowning at the scene. The cabin felt smaller, warmer, charged with an uncomfortable energy. Mitchell shifted his weight, his certainty wavering but his pride not quite ready to admit defeat. "Well, I just wanted to make sure everything was in order, you understand. Of course, these seats are quite expensive, and sometimes people can get confused during boarding." Angela felt a lifetime of similar moments pressing against her chest: the security guard who had followed her through a department store, the host who had assumed she was looking for the service entrance, the clerk who had questioned her right to enter the judge's chambers. Each time, she had maintained her dignity, had chosen her battles carefully. The woman in the aisle seat next to Angela suddenly spoke up. "Is there a problem here?" Her voice was sharp, clearly directed at Mitchell. "Because some of us would like to get this flight started without a scene." Mitchell's face reddened further. He glanced around, seemingly noticing for the first time that his actions had drawn an audience. The line behind him had grown longer, with several passengers showing clear signs of impatience. A voice from the back called out, "Can we get moving? Some of us have connections to make." This seemed to break the tension slightly, reminding everyone that they were, after all, on a commercial flight with a schedule to keep. Sarah, the flight attendant, finally took control of the situation. "Sir, if you could please find your seat, we need to prepare for departure." Her professional mask was back in place, though Angela noticed her hands fidgeting with her collar. Mitchell looked like he wanted to say more, but the combination of public attention and growing impatience from other passengers finally seemed to penetrate his bubble of certainty. He mumbled something that might have been an apology or another complaint and moved away, heading further down the aisle to his own seat. Angela watched him go, feeling the familiar mix of emotions that came with these encounters: anger at the assumption, weariness at its predictability, and a sort of resigned determination. She'd spent years building her career, earning her place not just in first class, but in the highest courts of the land. Yet moments like these reminded her that to some, she would always look out of place. She pulled out her book again, trying to find her way back to that peaceful moment she had before the interruption. But the words swam on the page, and her mind kept circling back to the encounter. She could feel Mitchell's presence several rows behind her, could sense the lingering attention of other passengers who had witnessed the scene. The plane's engines hummed steadily, and the flight attendants began their final preparations for takeoff. Angela closed her eyes briefly, gathering her thoughts. She knew this wouldn't be the end of it, these situations rarely were. The question now was how she would handle what came next, and what impact this moment might have on everyone who had witnessed it. The seatbelt sign had barely turned off when Angela made her decision. She'd spent too many years staying quiet, letting moments like these slide by. Maybe it was the fatigue from recent cases, or maybe it was thinking about what she'd tell Maya. But something inside her said, enough. She pressed the call button, and Sarah approached cautiously, clearly expecting a complaint about the earlier incident. Yes, ma'am? I'd appreciate it if you could pass a message to the gentleman who questioned my seating, Angela said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. Please let him know that Supreme Court Judge Carter would be happy to discuss proper protocol for first-class seating arrangements. The effect was immediate. Sarah's eyes widened, her professional mask slipping for just a moment. Around them, conversation stopped mid-sentence. The clicking of laptop keyboards ceased. Even the guy who had been snoring lightly 2 rows ahead seemed to wake up. Supreme Court? Sarah stammered, her face flushing. Judge Carter, I am so terribly sorry about earlier. I should have. Angela raised her hand slightly, the same gesture she used in court to quiet a rambling witness. No need for apologies yet. Just pass along the message, please. As Sarah hurried away, Angela could hear the whispers starting. They rippled through the cabin like a wave. Supreme Court Judge? Did she say Carter? The Angela Carter? She kept her eyes on her book, though she wasn't reading a word. The woman in the aisle seat leaned over. I knew you looked familiar, she said quietly. I saw you speak at my daughter's law school graduation last year, Berkeley, right? Angela nodded, offering a small smile. Good memory. How's your daughter doing? She's clerking in Boston now, actually. She mentions you all the time. You're kind of her hero. The woman paused. I'm Carla, by the way. And I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner about, before. Angela could respond, Sarah returned, looking flustered. Behind her came Mitchell, his face a shade of red Angela hadn't seen since a particularly embarrassing. Sometimes discomfort is necessary for growth, Angela said. The trick is making sure something good comes from it. The runway lights were visible now, strings of brightness guiding them home. But in the dim cabin, illuminated by the soft glow of reading lights, something remarkable had happened. A group of strangers had found common ground in an unexpected place. Their perspectives had shifted by a simple question of who belonged where. As the wheels touched down, Angela thought about how every landing was really just another beginning. The conversation started here wouldn't end with the flight, it would ripple outward, touching other lives, other moments, other opportunities for understanding. The plane had landed, but nobody seemed in a rush to leave. The usual scramble for overhead bins was notably absent as the conversation continued to flow through the first-class cabin. Angela found herself at the center of an impromptu forum that felt more intimate than any conference panel she'd ever led. Tell us about one of your cases, the tech consultant asked, his laptop now completely forgotten in his bag. Something that really made you think about these issues. Angela adjusted in her seat, considering which story to share. Around her, passengers settled back, airport connections temporarily forgotten. Even the flight attendants lingered, their duties momentarily paused. There was this case last year, she began, about a small business owner who'd been repeatedly denied loans despite perfect credit on paper. Everything looked straightforward, just another contract dispute. But during the testimony, something deeper emerged. The cabin was silent now, everyone leaning in slightly. The overhead lights cast a warm glow that made the space feel smaller, more personal. The bank had an automated system for processing applications, Angela continued, supposedly objective, purely data-driven. But someone had coded their assumptions into that system. Certain neighborhoods were flagged as high risk, certain names triggered additional verification steps. The tech consultant's eyes widened. Algorithmic bias, he said, we just had a huge discussion about this at work. Exactly. Angela nodded. The system wasn't explicitly discriminatory. It just happened to disadvantage certain groups more than others. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mitchell, still quiet in his row, was taking notes on his phone. The thing that struck me, Angela went on, was how everyone involved thought they were being perfectly fair. The developers had used historical data. The bank managers had followed procedures. But nobody had stopped to question whether those procedures themselves were carrying forward decades of bias. A woman in a corporate suit spoke up. "I work in HR," she said, "and we're dealing with something similar with our hiring software. It keeps favoring certain types of resumes, but we can't figure out why." "Because the past teaches the present," Angela said. "Unless we actively interrupt that cycle." Sarah, who had been standing nearby, suddenly joined the conversation. "It's like earlier today," she said, then blushed when all eyes turned to her. "I mean, I followed procedure, asking to check your ticket. But why did I feel the need to check it twice?" The honesty in Sarah's question hung in the air. Angela gave her an encouraging smile. "That's exactly the kind of self-reflection we need more of. It's not about blame, it's about awareness." A man in his 30s, who had been quiet throughout the flight, finally spoke up. "I'm a teacher," he said, "high school history. And listening to all this, I'm thinking about how I grade papers. Do I have unconscious expectations based on students' names, their backgrounds?" "The fact that you're asking that question is important," Angela replied. "I review my own decisions regularly, looking for patterns I might have missed." "We all should." Carla pulled out her phone and started typing. "I'm making notes for my daughter," she explained. "She's going to love this, especially the part about questioning procedures that seem neutral but aren't." The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing they were cleared to begin deplaning. Still, nobody moved. The conversation had created a bubble of understanding that no one seemed eager to break. "You know what this reminds me of," said the elderly woman with silver hair. "The lunch counter protests in the 60s. I was just a girl then, but I remember my mother explaining why it mattered where people could sit." Angela nodded, feeling the weight of that historical connection. "Progress isn't linear," she said. "Sometimes we need to revisit the same lessons from new angles. Each generation fights the same battles in different ways." The tech consultant raised his hand slightly, like a student in class. "But how do we make actual change?" he asked. "I mean, conversations like this are great, but they need to lead somewhere." Angela finished for him. "That's why I tell my law clerks to look for the ripple effects. Every decision we make, every policy we implement, every assumption we challenge, it all creates ripples." Mitchell finally spoke up from his seat. "I've been sitting here thinking about my firm's client meetings," he said, "how we always seem to have the same types of people in the room. Maybe it's time to look at why that is." The cabin stirred with murmurs of agreement. People were pulling out phones and notebooks, jotting down thoughts and ideas. The conversation had moved beyond the initial confrontation to something more constructive, more forward-looking. "Judge Carter," the student in the university sweatshirt asked, "would you mind if I quoted you in my sociology paper? This whole discussion, it's exactly what we've been studying about institutional change." "Of course," Angela smiled. "Just remember to cite it as Personal Communication Accidental Seminar at 30,000 feet. Laughter rippled through the cabin, but it was thoughtful laughter, the kind that acknowledges the serious underlying message while appreciating the moment of lightness. The flight attendants were now gently reminding everyone that they needed to deplane as passengers began gathering their belongings. There was none of the usual rush. Instead, people were exchanging contact information, continuing threads of conversation, making plans to stay in touch. "You've given us a lot to think about," Carla said, standing to retrieve her bag. "More than any diversity training I've ever attended." Angela watched as the cabin slowly emptied, noticing how different the atmosphere was from any flight she'd experienced before. People were leaving not just with their luggage, but with new perspectives, new questions to consider, new ways of seeing their own roles in creating change. As she gathered her own belongings, Angela thought about how sometimes, the most meaningful judgments weren't made from the bench, but in these unexpected moments of connection and understanding. The barriers that had seemed so solid at the start of the flight had begun to crack, letting in new light, new possibilities. As passengers began filing out of the plane, the energy had shifted into something Angela hadn't quite experienced before. It wasn't the usual rushed exodus, but rather a thoughtful, almost reluctant departure. People were lingering, finishing conversations, exchanging last thoughts. The tech consultant, she'd learned his name was James, was helping an elderly passenger with her carry-on while still discussing the implications of coded bias in software. The HR manager had her phone out, showing Sarah some resources about unconscious bias training that might be useful for airline staff. Judge Carter, Mitchell said, approaching her seat as the cabin slowly emptied. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something more genuine, more vulnerable. He stood there for a moment, struggling to find the right words. "Take your time," Angela said gently, recognizing the familiar signs of someone processing a significant shift in perspective. "I've been sitting back there thinking about everything that happened today," he began, his voice quieter than before, "and I realized something. I've probably been that guy, the one making assumptions, more times than I can count. I just never had anyone call me on it quite like this." Around them, other passengers slowed their departure, listening while pretending not to listen. The cabin had become a confessional of sorts, a safe space for difficult admissions. "The thing is," Mitchell continued, "I have 3 daughters. I'm always telling them they can be anything they want to be, but today made me wonder, what messages am I really sending them through my actions?" Angela thought about her own daughter, about all the subtle lessons children learn from watching their parents navigate the world. "Recognition is the first step," she said. "What matters now is what you do with that awareness." Carla, who was still gathering her things, joined the conversation. "It's like ripples in a pond, right?" she said. "Your daughters will see the change in you, and that will affect how they see themselves and others." "Exactly," Angela nodded. "Change doesn't always come from grand gestures or policy changes. Sometimes it's just one person deciding to think differently about their daily interactions." The flow of passengers had slowed to a trickle, but the remaining group seemed reluctant to break the spell of understanding that had settled over them. Sarah, now off duty, sat down in an empty seat. Her professional mask was completely gone. "You know what scares me," she admitted. "How easy it was to fall into that pattern earlier, check her ticket twice, assume something was wrong. I've been trained in customer service, in treating everyone equally, but still, those unconscious biases sneak in." Angela finished for her. "They're like muscle memory. We have to actively work to change them." The student in the university sweatshirt, Lisa, who'd introduced herself earlier, spoke up from where she was waiting in the aisle. "My professor talks about this," she said. "How systems of inequality persist because they're reinforced by hundreds of tiny, everyday actions that we don't even think about." "Your professor sounds wise," Angela smiled. "And you're absolutely right. It's not always about the big moments of obvious discrimination. Sometimes, it's about the small assumptions, the quiet doubts, the extra checks and balances we apply to some but not others." Mitchell ran a hand through his hair, messing up its careful styling. "I keep thinking about meetings at my firm," he said. "How quickly we dismiss certain ideas, certain voices. Maybe we need to examine why that happens." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the remaining passengers. Angela noticed how people were making notes in their phones, saving thoughts and insights for later reflection. Judge Carter, James, the tech consultant, said, "Would it be okay if I shared some of what we discussed today with my team? We're working on AI protocols, and this conversation about built-in bias could really impact how we approach the project." "Knowledge is meant to be shared," Angela replied. "Just remember that these conversations aren't about making people feel guilty, they're about making people aware." Sarah stood up, smoothing her uniform. "I'm going to talk to my supervisor about our training procedures," she said with newfound determination. "Maybe we need to look at them with fresh eyes." The last few passengers were gathering their belongings, but the atmosphere remained thoughtful and contemplative. Angela could see the subtle shifts in how people carried themselves, how they interacted with each other. The earlier tension had transformed into something more constructive, a shared understanding of the work still to be done. Carla finished collecting her things and turned to Angela one last time. "You know, I came on this flight worried about a big presentation tomorrow," she said. "Now I'm leaving with so much more than I expected. Thank you for turning an uncomfortable moment into something valuable." Mitchell, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke again. "Judge Carter, I know my earlier behavior was inappropriate, but I want you to know this has been one of the most educational experiences of my life. I won't forget it." As the last passengers prepared to leave, Angela noticed how they were different from the group that had boarded hours ago. There was a thoughtfulness in their movements, a new awareness in their interactions. Small changes, perhaps, but meaningful ones. The cabin, nearly empty now, held the echoes of their conversation, the admissions, the insights, the commitments to do better. Angela remained in her seat, watching as people carried these new understandings with them into the terminal and beyond. Sarah, the last to leave, paused at the doorway. "Sometimes the most important journeys aren't about where we're going," she said, surprising Angela with her insight. "They're about how we see things differently when we arrive." Angela smiled, thinking about how this flight, which had started with such tension, had transformed into something unexpected and valuable. As she finally stood to collect her own belongings, she felt hopeful about the quiet shifts that would ripple out from the shared experience, changes that might be small but could grow into something much more significant. She walked through the terminal, her carry-on rolling quietly behind her. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows as evening settled outside the large windows around her. Her fellow passengers had dispersed, each carrying a piece of their shared experience into the wider world. She spotted James, the tech consultant, already on his phone, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to someone about completely rethinking their algorithm parameters. A few gates down, Mitchell was sitting with his laptop open, apparently rewriting something with intense focus. They caught each other's eye, and he gave her a respectful nod. Her own phone buzzed, "Maya again." Angela texted back, "Wait until you hear about this flight." She could already imagine her daughter's reaction to the story, could picture the mix of pride and frustration that would cross her face. The weight of her conference speech materials in her bag felt different now. The carefully prepared words about constitutional interpretations suddenly seemed incomplete. She found an empty seat near her departure gate and pulled out her laptop. The terminal hummed with the usual airport noise, but she barely noticed it as she began to type. "Justice isn't just about laws," she wrote at the top of a new document. "It's about the small moments, the quiet choices, the daily decisions to see each other as fully human." The words flowed easily now, informed by the last few hours. A barista from a nearby coffee shop approached, carrying a cup. "Excuse me, Judge Carter," she said, "the lady over there asked me to bring you this." Angela looked up to see Carla waving from the coffee line, giving her a thumbs up before hurrying off to her connecting flight. The coffee cup had a message scrawled on it, "Thank you for teaching us all how to fly higher." Angela smiled, appreciating both the gesture and the wordplay. As she continued working on her speech, she noticed how other passengers from her flight were interacting with people around them. The HR manager was having an intense discussion with a colleague, pointing to something on her phone. The university student had struck up a conversation with an elderly couple, apparently explaining something about sociology and systemic change. Small ripples, spreading outward. The conference center was packed the next morning. Angela stood backstage, making final adjustments to her notes. The original speech about judicial precedents and constitutional interpretation had evolved into something more personal, more urgent. She thought about Sarah, the flight attendant who had sent her a LinkedIn message that morning, started a conversation with our training department. They're interested in reviewing our customer interaction protocols. Thank you for the inspiration. As the introduction began, Angela stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, the audience a sea of expectant faces. She saw name tags from law firms, universities, and government agencies, people who made decisions that affected countless lives. "I had a different speech prepared for today," she began, her voice clear and steady. "But something happened yesterday that made me rethink everything I wanted to say about justice in America." The audience leaned in slightly. Angela saw Mitchell in the crowd. He must have been registered for the conference all along. He sat up straighter, paying close attention. "We often talk about justice as something that happens in courtrooms," she continued, "but yesterday, at 30,000 feet, I witnessed justice taking shape in a different way. It started with a confrontation. One of those moments that people like me face regularly, but it ended with something remarkable, a group of strangers learning to see through each other's eyes." She shared the story of the flight, weaving in broader themes about bias, systems, and change. The audience was silent, engaged. She saw people taking notes, nodding in recognition, sometimes shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Sometimes, Angela said, the law can mandate equality, but justice requires something more from each of us. It requires the courage to examine our assumptions, the humility to admit our biases, and the commitment to do better. As she spoke, she noticed how the energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't just another keynote speech about legal theory. It was a call to action, grounded in real experience, real emotion. Yes, yesterday I watched people transform their understanding in real time, she continued. I saw how one difficult moment, handled with grace and openness, could become a catalyst for change. And I realized that maybe this is how progress really happens. Not just through landmark cases and sweeping legislation, but through countless small moments of recognition and growth. The rest of the conference passed in a blur of panels, discussions, and networking, but something was different. People weren't just talking about cases and statutes, they were sharing stories, examining their own experiences, asking harder questions. During the closing reception, a young lawyer approached her. Judge Carter, your speech this morning, it made me rethink how I'd been handling jury selection. I never considered how my own biases might be affecting my decisions. Angela collected these moments like pearls on a string, each one a small victory, each one a step towards something better. She thought about Maya, about the world she was inheriting, about how change happened in both big leaps and tiny steps. As she packed up her materials that evening, her phone lit up with a message from Sarah. Thought you'd want to know, new training protocols are in development. Your story is helping change things here. Disclaimer * this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people. As Angela finished her response to Mitchell, she closed her laptop and looked out the window at the city below. The soft glow of the lights reminded her of the journey ahead, one that would continue well beyond the confines of this conference and this hotel room. She thought about how every encounter, every conversation, and every choice could potentially shape the future in ways she could never fully predict. In the quiet of her hotel room, she reflected on the events of the day, the powerful ripple effect of a single, uncomfortable moment turned into a catalyst for change. It was a reminder that justice and progress were not always built through grand, sweeping reforms but often through these small, personal exchanges of understanding. These were the moments that, when accumulated, had the potential to shift the course of society. Angela felt a sense of gratitude for the flight that had started out as a simple trip to a conference but had turned into something far more meaningful. She thought about the people she had encountered on that plane, their candidness, the willingness to examine their biases, and the openness to learning from each other. It reminded her of the power of personal responsibility and the importance of engaging in difficult conversations, especially when it was uncomfortable. As the evening wound down and she prepared for another full day ahead, Angela realized that the work she did as a Supreme Court justice was important, yes, but so were the moments of human connection that often went unnoticed. She had the power to influence the law, but it was these small, personal interactions that ultimately determined how justice was lived and experienced by people on the ground. With that thought, she set aside her work for the evening and allowed herself to rest. Tomorrow, she would return to her duties as a judge, to the weight and responsibility of making decisions that would affect the lives of many. But tonight, she allowed herself the luxury of peace, a brief respite from the constant demands of the job, knowing that her work, both in and outside the courtroom, was making a difference. As she drifted off to sleep, Angela knew that, despite the challenges and obstacles she faced, she was on the right path, one step, one conversation, one decision at a time. And in this journey, perhaps the most profound moments of change would come not from her legal rulings, but from the connections she made with others along the way. The next morning, Angela was ready. She stepped onto the stage at the conference with a new perspective, carrying with her not just the weight of her experience as a judge but the power of the human connection she had made during that flight. The conversations from the plane had already started to ripple out, making a difference in small but significant ways. As she delivered her speech, Angela felt a renewed sense of purpose. She spoke not just from a legal standpoint but from the heart, sharing the lessons she had learned on the flight, lessons that extended far beyond the courtroom. Her words resonated with the audience, and she could feel the impact they had. The quiet conversations, the introspection, and the willingness to examine their own biases would stick with her listeners long after the conference ended. Later that day, Angela received several messages from the attendees, each one expressing gratitude for the insights she had shared. Some had already begun to implement changes in their organizations, and others were planning follow-up discussions. The ripple effect of one flight, one conversation, was continuing to spread, influencing more people than Angela had initially realized. As she prepared to head back to her chambers, Angela reflected on how these moments were, in many ways, the heart of justice. It wasn't just about the decisions made in the courtroom. It was about how people saw each other, how they treated each other, and how they chose to act in those quiet, everyday moments. She knew that there would always be more work to do, more challenges to face, but she also knew that change was happening, one conversation at a time. And sometimes, the most meaningful work of all happened when people, regardless of their background, stopped to listen, learn, and grow together. As she left the conference, Angela felt hopeful. There was a long road ahead, but with each conversation, each interaction, the world was moving just a little bit closer to the justice she had long worked to achieve. And for the first time in a while, she felt at peace with that. The end of the journey was just another beginning, and Angela was ready for whatever came next. As Angela boarded her flight back home, the quiet buzz of the airport filled the air. The conference had been a success, and the weight of her speech and the conversations that had followed lingered in her mind. But there was more. She was aware of the ripple effect she had started, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose in the work ahead. Settling into her seat, she was struck by how different the atmosphere of this flight felt compared to the one she had taken to Washington just a few days ago. The passengers seemed more at ease, the hum of the plane's engines no longer a background noise to her thoughts, but a soothing sound that now matched the pace of her heart. The flight attendant passed by, offering her a drink, and Angela smiled politely, accepting a water. She wasn't in the mood for coffee today, though her thoughts turned briefly to the barista from her earlier flight. She realized that, much like the ripple of change she had sparked in the conference room, small gestures, simple acts of kindness, attention, or understanding could have an impact that rippled outward as well. She thought of the young flight attendant, Sarah, who had seemed so nervous when Angela had asked for a message to be delivered. Sarah's act of courage had become a part of the larger conversation, one that would continue to spread as long as people remembered that it wasn't just the loudest or most obvious moments of injustice that required attention. It was the quiet ones, the overlooked interactions, the assumptions made in passing. As the plane lifted off the runway, Angela reflected on how even the most routine moments could carry weight. The long, quiet hours she had spent preparing for the conference, the unexpected confrontation with Mitchell, and now this flight, each one had added a layer to her understanding of her role in society. Being a Supreme Court justice was a huge responsibility, but it was only one part of who she was. There were so many layers to justice, so many ways it could be embodied in everyday life. The hum of the plane's engines settled into a rhythmic pulse, and Angela closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to just breathe. The weight of her position in the Supreme Court, her lifelong work, had always been with her, but there was something liberating about knowing that her influence could extend beyond the courtrooms, beyond the legal rulings. Her ability to shape the world, to teach, to challenge assumptions, didn't begin and end with her opinions on the bench. It extended into the very fabric of society. The plane began to ascend, and Angela allowed herself to imagine a future where this ripple of change didn't stop with her. A world where each person took ownership of their own biases, where conversations about justice were not relegated to conferences or courtrooms, but were happening every day in homes, businesses, schools, and on flights like the one she was on. She thought back to the conference and the lessons people had learned, how Mitchell had openly acknowledged his assumptions. How the tech consultant, James, had been moved to share the conversation with his team. How Carla had made notes for her daughter, recognizing the importance of understanding bias and taking it seriously. And Sarah, the flight attendant who had found the courage to ask herself hard questions. Angela smiled to herself. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this way, but the clarity she felt today was different. The work ahead, both in and out of the courtroom, was not easy, but it was meaningful. And it was work she would continue with the same dedication she had always given to her career. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign turned off, and Angela sat back, feeling the weight of her journey catch up with her. Not the physical exhaustion, but the emotional one. The emotional exhaustion that came from the realization that the battles she fought every day, whether in court or in life, were far from over. But she was ready for them. She had always been ready. And the ripples she had started would continue to spread, even when she couldn't see them. Maya texted her again, this time sending a funny meme that made her laugh. Angela responded with a message, "Wait until you hear about the flight back." This one was even more interesting than the first. Her daughter would probably ask for all the details, and Angela would share them, just as she always did. But this time, she knew the conversation would be different. She had something more to offer than just the stories of her work. She had something deeper, something more personal. Something that could inspire even more change. And as the plane began its descent toward her home, Angela realized that, sometimes, the most meaningful moments of transformation were not those of grand speeches or landmark rulings. They were the moments when people listened, understood, and decided to be better. As she deplaned, Angela noticed the familiar rush of airport crowds, people hurrying to their gates, the sound of rolling suitcases, the chatter of strangers. But this time, the rush felt different. There was no immediate pressure on her. No appointments awaiting her arrival. Just a quiet anticipation of what she would do next. She walked through the terminal with a calmness she hadn't felt in a long time. As she approached the baggage claim, she caught sight of a familiar face, her law clerk, Thomas, waiting with a warm smile. "Welcome back, Judge Carter," he said, offering to help with her bags. Angela smiled back. "Thanks, Thomas. It's good to be home." They walked together toward the exit, the weight of the journey behind her, but also the knowledge that the next chapter was already beginning. There would be more flights, more speeches, more rulings. But in all of those moments, the quiet work of change, both in her own heart and in the hearts of others, would continue. As she stepped outside into the crisp air, Angela took a deep breath. The work was far from over, but she felt ready to face it all. For she knew that, one conversation, one small moment at a time, progress was happening. And she would be there to help it unfold, wherever she went.